David Barton is founder and president of WallBuilders.com. He explains the truths that have made America an exceptional nation. Why has America become the greatest nation on earth? We'll hear from David Barton on this edition of Politics and Religion.
Look, there are two things I don't discuss: politics and religion.
In my house, we don't talk about politics and we don't talk about religion.
I'll talk to you about anything except politics and religion.
I never talk about politics and religion.
Politics determines how we'll live here on earth. Religion determines how we'll live forever. I'm Irvin Baxter. I think it's time we talk about it. We have a very special guest on our program today. You will not want to miss it. Mr. David Barton is the founder and president of WallBuilders organization. He has spoken to numerous state legislatures, consulted with both state and federal legislators on different bills at different times, and has written amicus briefs in cases at the U.S. Supreme Court. In my opinion, David is the foremost voice in America espousing the principles on which our nation was originally founded. So it's with great pleasure today that I bring to you Mr. David Barton. Welcome to the program, David.
Thanks. Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
I was just absolutely enthralled as I went through your DVD, Exceptional, and I'd heard this term, American exceptionalism, several times. And at first when I heard it, it sounded a little bit egotistical, but that's not really what is meant by American exceptionalism, is it?
No, not at all. And this is one of the problems. People react to what they think it means rather than what it actually does mean. But when you look at a dictionary and look up the word exceptional, it just means something that is not the ordinary. It is out of the ordinary. And when you look at America, and this is not a matter of pride or arrogance or cockiness. You look at America, our stability is not the norm. We are the exception, not the rule. We have had one Constitution since 1789. In that same period of time, France has had 15. You go to Haiti with 21. You go to Venezuela with 25. You just go through the other nations of the world. We are exceptional with stability. We are the exception, not the rule. If you're 95 years old today and you live in Poland, you have lived through 7 constitutions. If you're a baby boomer in South Korea, you have lived through 6 constitutions. Nobody in America thinks about a revolution or a constitution. Never crosses our mind, but it does for nearly everyone else in the world. So in that sense, we're the exception, not the rule.
Yeah,
when you look at creativity, there's
David,
ways to make...
You listed a couple of other things that really impressed me in your DVD.
Yes, sir.
That point out American exceptional. You were talking about the gross national product of our country.
Yes, sir.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, gross national product is the economic output that is done by a nation, what they generate with their economics. And in America's case, we have 4% of the world's population, and theoretically, statistically, 4% should produce 4% of whatever. But in our case, 4% of the world's population produces 25% of the world's gross domestic product, the economic output. And it's not because that we have greater natural resources. We don't. In America, I'm a cowboy, and America, only 1% of our gross domestic product is agriculture, but we're the 3rd highest agricultural producing nation in the world, and we're only 66 in the world in percentage of farmable land. So there's many nations with much more resources than we, and yet we take what we have and make it go much further. So our GDP, our gross domestic product, is way out of a skelter for any other nation. 4% of the population, 25%, or nearly 1/4 of the world's total economic output.
So the question then is, are there principles that make this happen? Is this just a phenomenon and nobody knows why it has occurred? Or are there things that we can put our finger on that we should really be aware of, because if we're not aware of them and we forget them and we leave them, then all the blessings that we've experienced may well leave us. So that's what we'd really like to talk about. And all of you that are listening today, I'd like for you to pay very close attention, because David is an expert on enumerating these things and does it so skillfully. And so I'd like for us just to get into, David, the principles of American exceptionalism. On your DVD, you listed 5 principles. And if you would, go through those and expound on each of those as much as you care to. But I'd like for people to hear them. And if you're out there listening today, you might want to get a pen and paper, and you may want to write these things down. Better than that, you can get David's DVD on the exceptionalism. You would probably want to do both of those things. Nevertheless, just walk us through this, because we need to be reminded.
And it is important to point out that what America experiences is not because it's just a happy accident. We just happen to show up at the right place in the universe at the right time. The Bible teaches that there are causes and effects. There are consequences. There are things that cause certain things. And it's that way with America. If we have stability or prosperity or whatever, other nations don't, it's not because we're lucky and they're not. It's because we're implementing a set of ideas that produce those fruits. We're told in the Scriptures, man thinks in his heart, so is he. We're told throughout the Scripture the way we think produces certain behavior, certain actions, certain consequences. And that's America, too. So you've asked the right question, is what produced this? And fortunately, in our case, America was an experiment in the sense that we introduced a philosophy that had never before been implemented in the history of the world. It came as a consequence of a generation that studied the Bible. They studied history. They looked at consequences. They looked at, as they said, they judged a tree by its fruits. They looked at what worked and what didn't. And so when it came time to form this nation, after years of studying, and we know from their writings, the books they studied, we know that it was Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws and Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws and John Locke's 2 treatises of government, and they took some out of that, and they took a lot out of the Bible. And when it came time to form the nation in the Declaration of Independence, they start out with 126 words to tell the entire world our philosophy of government. We're going to be the first nation in the history of the world to do these things. And in those 126 words, they set forth 5 principles. We used to teach this in school. We used to memorize this section of the Declaration. We used to know these principles. And unfortunately, we have moved away from them in recent years, and we've become less exceptional in recent years as we've moved more and more away from these principles.
So our forefathers were coming out of England. They had fled because of the oppression of big government. And so these great men were looking for what could make a nation really be great, to be the kind of nation we would want to live in, raise our children in, our grandchildren. So this was really quite a journey for these wonderful founding fathers, and what they did when we look back on it. And as I was watching your DVD, I thought, these people were not just stumbling through the dark. They were studious, they were thinkers, and they were trying to figure out, okay, what went wrong in England that caused us to be under the oppression of ever-increasing government, and how can we avoid that in America? And so that was the driving force behind them as they put together the Declaration of Independence. So take us on down through these principles that they discovered and that they implemented.
Yeah, and another point to make is not only did they discover, they implemented them before they did the Declaration, because even though we were British colonies, our state governments were so unlike Great Britain. I mean, we elected our officials here. We elected our officials in both church and state, which we felt was the biblical thing to do out of Exodus 18 and Deuteronomy 16. And Great Britain wasn't doing that. And so already in our states, we were experiencing what we believed to be good government in our colonies. And so when Great Britain got heavy-handed and tried to take over our governments, and they tried to shut down several of our governments, that's when the founders said, no, we're not going to do it. We've already experienced the good fruits. And the first thing they say in those 126 words is they make the announcement that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And they start with the thought that we are a creation of God. And as they explain, there are several consequences of that. If we're the creation, he's the creator. And if he's the creator, then he has the moral authority to tell us how to conduct ourselves in all aspects of life, including our government. And so the first thing they tell the world is, look, we're not a secular people. We're not a secular government. We start with the belief that there is a God above us who tells us how to live our life, including how to run our government. And so from that point, they did something to distinguish themselves from other nations. And by the way, that is the first step to limited government, because they have now made the announcement that, hey, government, there's something higher than you. It's God. Secular governments try to become God, whether you look at France or whether you want to look at Morocco or whether you want to look at Spain or Portugal, you look at Germany, you look at Greece, you look at Turkey. Government tries to become God and run every aspect of every person's life and take care of all their needs. In America, we said not so. God is God. Government is not God. Government is way below God. And so that's the first significant announcement. And by the way, the cases you mentioned where I've been involved with the Supreme Court all dealt with religious expressions in public. And the court has taken a position that says, well, we got religious people, we have non-religious people, we can't show preference one over the other. Government has to be neutral between religion and non-religion. That's not the American founding. That document says at the top, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. This was our governments of the time saying we're all unanimous on this. There is a creator God. He has the moral authority to tell us how to run our lives, including our government. And that's the starting place for American government. And that really made us different from the rest of the world. So that was the first principle that made us different.
So if we lose these principles, then we're going to lose the result of these principles. And I'm so glad you're really emphasizing that the first law, the first principle, was that government acknowledges that there is a divine creator. And so all of you out there listening today, if we go off of that, if you destroy the foundation, the whole house collapses. And so lead us on now. We're about a minute away from our first break here. I'll tell you what, let's do. I don't want you to get started on something that you can't complete. Let's take a moment to tell people, I noticed with interest that you produced something called the Founders Bible. Tell us about the Founders Bible, would you?
We own about 100,000 documents from before 1812. So I have thousands of the handwritten documents of George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, etc. And what I've noticed over the years is how often they quoted Bible verses as the basis of specific policies they implemented. So a number of years ago, the Lottman Foundation said, we want to bring the NASB Bible back out. Would you do the commentary? And I said, no, I won't, but I know somebody who will. And so we simply let the Founding Fathers comment on the various Bible verses and show how they applied practically to economics, to healthcare, to government, to education, to everything you can think of. So that's what the Founders Bible is. It is actually letting the guys who started this nation talk about how the Bible applies to every aspect of life and how it shapes every part of our culture.
Now, I was looking at this, and it says you got 2,272 pages in this.
Yes, sir. They had a lot to say about the Bible and how to use it and how to apply it. And I tell you, they have great commentaries, and they talk to the very issues we deal with today. It's a great perspective.
If you would like to have your own copy of the Founders Bible, simply go to WallBuilders.com, and we'll be back.
One day, I was listening to Politics and Religion, much like you are now, when a commercial came on about the Salvation Package. It's a set of 4 DVDs in which Irvin teaches about topics like Nicodemus' question to Jesus, "What must I do to be born again?" I remember Irvin said in the commercial, "If you don't love the truth, don't get this because it will make you mad." Well, I was hungry for the truth, so I did get it, and I am so glad I did. I'd been studying the Bible for many years, but learned there was more in the Scriptures about what it means to be born again. When the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Jesus said, "Take heed of false teaching, for many will come in my name and deceive many." Now I know what Jesus was talking about when he made that statement, and I won't be deceived. The Salvation Package changed my life and my eternity. I'm so thankful for that commercial I heard just a few years ago. That's why today I wanted to record one too, for someone out there listening, searching for the truth. You will find it in the Salvation Package. Get the 4 DVD set for $65 or the individual DVDs for $20 each.
In case you're just joining us, our guest today is Mr. David Barton, the founder and president of WallBuilders.com. I want to back up a moment before we continue discussing the principles of American exceptionalism. WallBuilders.com, interesting name for an organization. Take a moment to tell us, why did you choose the name Wall Builders? What's that mean? What's behind it?
WallBuilders is the name that we take out of the Bible book of Nehemiah. And we think Nehemiah is a great story in so many areas because it deals with a nation who had been great and strong, and it was torn down. In their case, their walls were torn down, and that was one of the measurements of the strength and prosperity and honor of a nation was the walls. That was the security and safety, and so they were torn down. And so as Nehemiah goes back to rebuild the walls, he gathers the people together. And in Nehemiah 2:17, he says, look at the distress we're in. Let's rebuild the walls so it will no longer be a reproach. We said, that's a great call for America. Look at the distress we're in. Let's not be a reproach. Let's rebuild these things that have been our foundations. And so that is the largest grassroots effort in the Bible. They, at the beginning of the book, thought it was impossible. It's too far gone. We'll never get this rebuilt. And Nehemiah says, no, it'll happen. And when they all did a part, and I'm always amazed at the people who, we're talking stonemasons, and yet you have a man and his daughters, you have perfume makers, you have apothecaries, you have jewelers, you have soldiers. People who didn't know anything about it got out there, and when they got involved, it turned around. And 52 days later, it's finished. They're all amazed. And we think that's a story for America, is that if we can get involved in rebuilding our local communities, our local areas, if everybody will do their part, this is not a hard ship to turn. But if we refuse to do our part, as many did with Nehemiah, we'll end up living outside the wall when God's protection and blessing goes back up on the nation.
Well, David, actually, you've made it pretty simple here, because a lot of times many of us are thinking, I know something's wrong, I know something needs to be done, but I don't have a clue where to start.
Yeah.
But with your name, Wall Builders, and especially with the lesson behind that name, really what you're saying to us is if we can rediscover these 5 principles, just to make it simple, to boil it down to its essence, if we could get back where our entire nation, all of our politicians, our ministers, our school teachers, our professors, if all of us could master these 5 principles and accept them, believe them, and affirm them, then we could probably build this nation back faster than we think we can.
Oh, I tell you, there are so many examples that we see on a daily basis of this. And just to talk about how this applies locally, one of the things that you have to learn in this, and this is a difficulty we have right now in our modern era, we are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, watching national news of some kind. And so we look at it and we said, man, I wish I could make the president like Israel. I wish I could make the Senate pick up the 287 bills the House has passed. I wish I could make the Supreme Court know how to define marriage. And we look at that and we can't do it. I can't. I'm really connected in D.C. and I can't make a change in any of that. And so what happens is we get paralyzed. And yet the right response is when you look at the first 4 battles of the American Revolution, the Battle of Lexington, the Battle of Concord, the road to Boston, and Bunker Hill, nobody contacted the Commander-in-Chief, George Washington, and said, hey, your national headquarters, what do you want us to do? In the case of Lexington, it was the Reverend Jonas Clark who took 74 guys out of his church, and they went out and took on the 700 British, said, this is our town, we'll take care of our town. Washington, you go do other stuff, we got our town. Then when the British went to North Bridge at Concord, there was the Reverend William Emerson with 300 guys, and they said, hey, we'll take care of Concord, no worries, we got it done. On the road to Boston battle, it was the Reverend Payson Phillips and the Reverend David French and all these other guys that we got our congregations, we'll take care of this one. You get to Bunker Hill, there's the Reverend Willard who grabbed 2 companies out of his church and said, got it. And so it was that rebuilding of local stuff. And I say that to say that I was just talking with the lady recently who's there's 40,000 in her town, and they had school board elections, and their school board is trying to move in a very secularist, anti-biblical direction. And she said, no, I can do something about that. So she ran for school board, and she got elected in a town of 40,000. She only had 35 votes cast in that election. I mean, a Sunday school class can elect a city council if they'll just do it. And so if we'll take ownership of our local communities and stop worrying about what we can't fix at the national level, this thing will go back up so much faster than we imagine. One more quick example, Southside School District in San Antonio, about 50,000 there. A pastor of a small church said, I think there's corruption on the board. And so he tried to get involved, and they shut him out and wouldn't let him talk, wouldn't let him go to the meetings. They adjourned the meetings when he showed. And so he just got with other pastors, and they ran 5 candidates for school board and got all 5 of them elected. So they own the school board now, so it's a whole different game. And that's the kind of stuff that we can do. We never hear about that on the news, but that is the story of Nehemiah rebuilding the walls. Everybody get out and take care of your own place right around you, and if you do that, the whole walls will go back up in the nation.
Well, the Bible is full of examples of one person being able to make a difference, and I think all of us have to believe that, embrace that, or else we'll feel like we're paralyzed. Now, let's get back, David. We're talking about the principles that have made America an exceptional nation. The first one we've covered, government acknowledges that there is a divine creator. If you take that one out, then everything is skewed from the outset. But lead us on beyond that. Take us to the next one.
The next thing the Declaration talks about is the fact that not only are we created, but we're endowed with our Creator with certain inalienable rights. And they said, among others, is life, liberty, and property. And John Adams and other founding fathers talked about this, that there are a certain set of rights that came from God before government ever existed. And John Adams said it's antecedent. And the first government in the history of the world is Genesis 9. After the flood, God established what we call the Noahide laws, 7 categories of civil laws to govern the culture and the society. And so the founding fathers said inalienable rights are what you find in Genesis 1 through 8. And they identified about 24 rights that came from God. And the reason that became significant was this is a matter of jurisdictions. By saying there is a creator, and by saying that the creator gives us a certain set of rights, what they did was just establish a line that says, by the way, government, these rights don't belong to you, they belong to God, therefore you can't touch them. And so there were about 24 categories that they said are not available. And by the way, under the founders' original belief, it's Genesis 1 that defines marriage as a lifelong union of a man and a woman. Therefore, in previous generations, you'll find the courts would not touch marriage because they said, we didn't create it. God created it. Now, we can mess with what we did, but we didn't create this, so we can't change it. And so that was the jurisdictional line. That was the second line they drew to give you limited government. The first is that government is not God, and the second is that government can't touch everything it wants to. It can't touch what God has already touched. And so that was the second principle that made us exceptional, was we limited government to only the things that government's allowed to touch. And that's why in the Constitution, we only allowed the federal government to touch 17 things. Nothing else could they touch. Everything else belonged in a different jurisdiction. So that second declaration establishes jurisdictional lines. And that is so important for having limited government. But that was a unique philosophy 200 years ago when kings did everything. They told you what your doctrine was. They told you what your religion was. They told you which church to go to. They told you what you could or couldn't do with your family and your land and your home and your job and your business and your career. And those all got put off limits by the founding fathers in that second point of American exceptionalism.
So let's make sure everybody gets the second point in case you're writing it down out there. Government acknowledges that certain rights came from the Creator. We are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and as David has said, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and also property. So this is the second, and we're not going to be able to exhaustively deal with all this. David does it in his great DVD, Exceptionalism, but we're not going to be able to go into all that because we've got some other things we want to do. We're going to keep moving here, but I know you want to write these down. So number 2, government acknowledges that certain rights came from the Creator. Okay, lead us on, Dave.
So at that point, when they come from the Creator, they then become off limits, and that's significant. So the next thing the Declaration says, that to secure these rights, what rights? Well, inalienable rights. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. We now know the purpose of government. Government exists for the purpose of securing the rights that God told us we had. And in addition to the three in the Declaration, the Founding Fathers 11 years later said, now that we've won the revolution, let's go ahead and tell you some more. You have the First Amendment right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience. You have the Second Amendment right to defend yourself. You have the Third Amendment right to the sanctity of the home. You have the Fourth Amendment right to justice and civil process. You have the Fifth Amendment right to own private property. So they went through and listed other inalienable rights. And so we're told the third purpose, the third point in American exceptionalism is that government exists, first and foremost, not to make sure we've all got jobs, not to make sure that we're prosperous, but to make sure that we have the right to practice those God-given rights. And we're already seeing, as we become more secular, that the government's saying, no, wait a minute, you're believing the wrong things here. You can't say God in public. What are you thinking about? Hey, that's a God-given right to acknowledge God according to the dictates of conscience. Government's supposed to protect that, not regulate that. You can't defend yourself in certain situations. You're not allowed to have self-defense weapons. No, government can't regulate that. So we're watching as we become more secular that we're losing the practice of our inalienable rights, but that is the primary purpose of government. And I will emphasize the Founding Father says first right is the right to life. And we often think today, well, that couldn't have been abortion because they didn't deal with abortion. Yes, they dealt with abortion back then. As a matter of fact, the Old Testament deals with abortion. The only thing that changes with abortion is the technology you use, not the fact that it exists. Founding Fathers had clear laws that dealt with abortion, and their belief was if you don't protect the right to life first, if you get off track at the intersection there, then you'll be off track on everything else you do. So they said if you don't first protect the right to life, then you're not going to protect the private rights of self-defense or of marriage or anything else. And we're seeing that today, too, that the life issue is what distinguishes someone who believes in limited government from someone who believes in a very controlling government. And that's the third principle of American exceptionalism, is government exists to protect inalienable rights, the first of which is the right to life.
You know, David, I remember sort of getting off track myself thinking, you know, we've got our Constitution to tell the government what it can do. But as I studied it one day, I realized that's not the purpose of the Constitution. The purpose of the Constitution is to put handcuffs on the government.
That's right.
And to limit what it can do and to tell it cannot infringe upon our inalienable rights. And once I saw things that way, it really made things clear to me and made me realize the value of our Constitution.
Yeah, and that is exactly, handcuffs is a great word, because the history of the world has been the history of government getting into and intruding and starting to control. And when that happens, prosperity goes down, freedom goes down, bondage goes up, tyranny goes up, elitism goes up, popular government goes down, and there's not an exception to that in the history of the world. And so that's why they were so cognizant of the fact that you have to draw lines, and I love your word, handcuffs. You have to put handcuffs on government. And as you look in the early Supreme Court cases, for example, in the McCulloch case of 1819, they very clearly said the purpose of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution is to prevent the government from touching those areas. And now the government uses those very areas to control what we do and control the states and people and et cetera. And it's such a reversal. You're exactly right, brother.
Before we're finished, I'd like to ask David about some of the politicians running for president, and do they hold these same principles that he's espousing here today?
In a world where our culture is traveling down a road of spiritual mediocrity, do you want to be one of the few who travel the road of spiritual maturity? Then I recommend Endtime University. This 6-semester course will guide you through understanding the Bible, keys to spiritual growth, life and teachings of Jesus Christ, and Satan defeated, sonship restored. Watch the lessons at your own pace using the structured outlines. Use the quizzes and answers to test your comprehension. Receive a completion certificate when you finish each semester, and a diploma from Endtime University once you've completed all 6 semesters. Matthew 7:13 through 14 says, "Enter in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many will go in. Because straight is the gate and narrow is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it. Endtime University will help you walk the straight and narrow path to spiritual maturity. Call 1-800-ENDTIME and ask about Endtime University today.
Attention Fort Smith, Bentonville, and Lincoln, Arkansas. Irvin Baxter's coming to your area for an Endtime conference. He will be speaking on subjects such as America's God-given destiny, God's prophetic timeline, Breaking Prophetic Fulfillment's Q&A session, and the Great Tribulation. Endtime conferences are a great opportunity to meet Irvin and hear the latest events going on in Bible prophecy. Shop Endtime product and meet other people like you who are wanting to learn the prophecies of the Bible. Every time I go to an Endtime conference, I feel so energized, like one of the people that can be strong and do exploits, as Daniel 11:32 says. Go to endtime.com and under events, click the conference link or call 1-800-ENDTIME to find out more details about these conferences. We'll see you there.
By the way, this coming Sunday evening, I will be speaking at the Garland North Cities United Pentecostal Church. All of you are invited. That will be at 6 o'clock on Sunday evening. The address is 502 Beltline in Garland, Texas. So any of you that would like to be out there for that meeting, we would more than welcome you. That's this coming Sunday at 6 p.m., 502 Beltline in Garland, Texas. Now, I want to get back with our tremendous guest today, Mr. David Barton, and such a wealth of knowledge. We're just barely scratching the surface. So I would suggest to you that if you find things that David has said that has really struck a chord in your heart, go to WallBuilders.com. That's his website. And there is a wealth of information. There's a catalog. I became entranced when I was flipping through the catalog before the program today. Some of the wonderful things, I wanted to get one of each. But anyway, go through there. You will find some things that you want. And I know that you would appreciate those things. Now let's get back to our subject today, David, because we're going through right now the 5 principles of American exceptionalism. We've gone through, number 1, government acknowledges that there is a divine creator. Number 2, government acknowledges that certain rights came from the creator. Number 3, government acknowledges its primary purpose is to protect our God-given rights. That was number 3. Okay, lead us on.
Number 4 deals with the fact that we acknowledge that there are fixed moral values. These are not things that we vote on or the things that change across time. This is what was often called the moral law. We acknowledge it in the Declaration by calling it the laws of nature and of nature's God. That's an 8-word phrase. Most folks today don't recognize that phrase, or they think it's somehow deistic because it talks about nature's God, the God of nature. But it came out of the most famous law book of that day, and everybody back then knew that phrase instantly. And William Blackstone, who did that law book, explained that there is a dual revelation of God. The first we find in Romans 1, where that amazingly the Bible tells us that everything that can be known about God, including the intricacies of the Godhead, has been revealed through what God has created, so that even the heathen are without excuse. So without need for use of the Bible, we can go to nature and find that God has established certain rights and wrongs. It is a law of nature, the right of self-defense. It is a law of nature, the liberty. There's no 10 million species in nature. No species in nature enslaves another species. That's why the Declaration calls that an inalienable right. You have a right to try to make a living. Every species, from the time it comes on the earth, has the right to try to make a living. It may not be successful, but nobody can stop them from trying to survive and make a living. You go into even moral things like abortion. 10 million species, there is not a species that kills its young still in the womb. That is a violation of the law of nature. I don't need the Bible to tell me that. Same with homosexuality. Half a dozen of 10 million species have homosexuality in some degree, but it's always an aberration. It is never a lifestyle. So I can learn that through nature. But because, as Blackstone pointed out, once we sinned, our understanding was darkened. We didn't see what God wanted very clearly. God, in His compassion for us, wrote it all down and gave us the Bible. That's the revealed law. That's the laws of the God who created nature. So between the laws of nature and of nature's God, we know what rights and wrongs are. And as you go through the scriptures, that's what they call the moral law. So whether it's arson, whether it is rape, whether it is incest, whether it is consanguinity, which is marriage, whether it deals with robbery or burglary, whether it deals with abortion or anything else, we incorporated that in the Seventh Amendment of the Constitution. That became the common law in America. So that we have a fixed moral set of rights and wrongs that we don't deviate from. Outside of that, we can say, well, it's wrong to speed. It's wrong to go 85 in the 75 zone. But that's not a moral wrong. That is a wrong of society. That's a cultural wrong, but not a moral wrong. So that was the fourth thing they did, was give us a set of rights and wrongs that don't change with time. They've been here for 5,500 years. They'll be here till Christ returns in the end of time. And that's a fixed way to run a nation, is you don't have to vote on whether marriage is a man and a woman. It's always a man and a woman under the laws of nature and nature's God.
Right. So we have two sections to item number 4, the laws of nature and the laws of nature's God. Some things are easy to observe. You can know there's a God by watching the sun come up, by watching a newborn baby born. It's too intricate for there not to be a maker. I mean, a beautiful automobile. All of us like a beautiful automobile, but if someone told you that no one made that it just evolved and showed up on the beach one day, you would laugh them to scorn. So there are some things that nature itself teaches us, but then, as David has pointed out, we have the laws of nature's God as are revealed in the Bible to solidify these things. So that's a real wonderful insight. So number 4, there exists a fixed moral law that nobody has the right to change. Okay, lead us on to the next one, David.
The fifth one talks about that it's what we call the consent of the governed. And in the Declaration, it talks about how that we do the things according to the consent of the governed. And it's significant. This is what we call the majority rule. This is where we vote and the majority wins. And that's what our elections are based on. That's what so much else is based on. George Washington said the rule of the majority. He talked about how that was the constitutional foundation of the country. But it's significant that this is point number 5 in what they say, the fact that we vote on things and that the majority wins. And by the way, notice that the first 4 are all God-centered. There is a creator. The Creator gives a certain set of rights to man. Government exists to protect the rights the Creator gave to man, and the Creator has given us a fixed moral law. And then number 5, we get to vote on things. What's significant is that's number 5, which means we don't vote on what the Creator did. We do not vote. We do not have a referendum on whether rape will be a crime or not. Rape is a crime under the laws of nature, nature's God. We don't vote on that. We don't vote on whether you can defend yourself, or whether you can have liberty, or whether you can own property. Those are the laws of nature, nature's God. But we can vote on whether the sidewalk should be 6 feet wide, 7 feet wide, or 8 feet wide. We can vote on whether the traffic fine should be $65, $80, or $130. We can vote on whether the speed limit should be 45, 55, 65, or if you're in Texas now 85. We can vote on that. And those are called social compact laws. So the fifth thing is that below the level of all of these the Creator-ordained rights, we can vote on the rest of it, and the majority wins. Those are the 5 principles that made America different from every other nation at that time, and quite frankly, that have made us different from every other nation since then, and it's why we have been the exception and not the rule for other nations. Now, again, the further we get away from these 5 points, the more secular we become, the less they work. And we have seen in the last 10 years that America is no longer number 1 in the world in political freedom. We're now number 23. We're no longer the most corruption-free government. We're now down to number 19 in the world. I mean, it's sliding, but it's getting back to these principles. This is what made us unique, and this is what we have to preserve if we're going to stay unique.
Tremendous truth that David is pointing out to all of us. I don't want you to miss it. And that is, as you go through this list, the ones lower on the list have no authority to change those above it. You always obey the higher law. as you go through the list. Now, we could spend a lot of time on these incredible principles, and thank you very much, David, for putting this wonderful presentation together for us. Now, we've just simply scratched the surface. However, we do have a copy of David's DVD, Exceptional, and it's available to you right now. All you have to do is go to his website, and I really, really would recommend, because I know we've moved through this really fast, and it may not have been possible. You might be driving. Perhaps you couldn't write things down, but once you get the DVD, you'll have it, and you can not only show it to watch it yourself, but you can show it to your family and friends. That's the way we start building the walls back. We've got to get these principles reinstilled. I want to sort of shift gears now, because David, there's been so much harm done to America using the argument of separation of church and state. Now, everybody says, we can't use the name of Jesus in public prayers anymore. We cannot have the Ten Commandments on the courthouse lawn anymore. But yet we've had it for 200 years, and all of a sudden it has become off limits to us. Explain to us, how do we get where we are, and how do we fix it?
Well, we get where we are. We got where we are a little at a time. The Scripture tells us in multiple locations, little leaven leavens the whole loaf. Nothing happens fast and overnight. It happens very slowly. I love what we see in Matthew 13, where Jesus talked about how that a man had good fruit growing in his field, good seed, and he woke up one morning and it was filled with tares. And how that happened. And Jesus, Matthew 13:25 says, when the good men went to sleep, the enemy came in and sowed the tares. And so what has happened to us has been a slow process over time. It has not been quick. And with that process, what has continued to happen is we have changed what we know about our own history. The Bible is very clear in pointing out that the way that a people views its history will affect the way that people behaves. That's why when you look at biblical revivals under Asa, Jehoshaphat, Josiah, whatever, always involved is that they returned and found their history. With Josiah, they found the scroll in the temple, and they said, whoa, we used to be like this. Finding that scroll led to the national revival. So it always involves going back and learning and seeing the history, and that's why the Scripture, dozens of verses say, recall the former days, remember the former times, etc. That'll be the solution, is going back and seeing how we were founded, because today we've never heard these 5 principles. We never knew them. We always used to cover them in school, but we don't cover them now. So we got off track because literally the good men went to sleep. We get back on track when we go back and rediscover, like Josiah did, the old scroll and say, you mean we used to be like this? We can do this again. God's people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, Hosea tells us, and once you get the knowledge, you can stop the destruction.
So when the Second Amendment tells us that or maybe it's the First Amendment, tells us, the government shall make no law concerning the establishment of a religion, nor the free exercise thereof.
Yes.
Does that mean then that we cannot have God in government?
See, and that's a great point, because there's 2 things that are worth mentioning here at this point. One is the intent of that amendment. The intent of that amendment was that we had just come through 1,000 years of world history where the government had taken over the church. That happened in 371 A.D., where the government took over the church and said, oh, by the way, we just passed a law, you're all going to be Christians or you're going to die. And while you're at it, here's what you will do with the doctrines, and here's the churches you will attend. And we went through 1,000 years of that. And then with the Reformation, as guys got back to the Bible, a book they hadn't seen in 1,000 years, they weren't allowed to read it, and it was not in a language they could read. And they get back to say, man, have we been messing this up? And so they start calling for a separation of church and state. That happens in the 1500s in England. The Pilgrims, the Puritans, others are being thrown in jail for going to the wrong church.
Tell you what, hold your thought right there, David. We'll be right back. We have 1 segment left. Stay with us. I want to introduce you today to what I call the Armageddon Hospital. It was October of 2010. The headline, Israel builds world's largest underground hospital, immediately arrested my attention. When I read that it was being built in Haifa, Israel, I fully understood the implications of this announcement. Haifa is located at the western end of the plain of Megiddo, the prophesied site of the Battle of Armageddon. Would the world's largest underground hospital, specifically designed for use in time of war, actually become the hospital to which the wounded of the Battle of Armageddon would be brought? It was obvious to me that the answer to this question was undoubtedly yes.
Go to endtime.com and under Irvin's Thoughts, click the Rambam link to watch the video.
I grew up in church, and like most kids, I learned the 10 Commandments. But the 4th commandment bothered me through the years. What does it mean to keep the Sabbath? Am I supposed to keep it like they did in the Old Testament? That's why I was glad to hear Irvin come out with a new DVD, To Sabbath or Not to Sabbath. Like most end-time videos, I was enlightened to see what had been in the Bible all along, but didn't know it was there. He laid out the scriptures in an easy-to-follow lesson, and now I don't have to worry anymore. I know how to keep the Sabbath. Get your copy today.
Well, we've got so much to talk about and so little time to do it. So we were talking about the separation of church and state. And when this all boils down, and David, you correct me if I'm not saying this exactly right, but this First Amendment was not to create freedom from religion. It was to create freedom of religion.
That's right.
Because earlier in these laws that you've laid out for us, you can't have freedom from God, because then you destroy the very foundation for the 5 principles of American exceptionalism. First of all, government acknowledged there is a divine creator. So this is not freedom from religion that our forefathers were attempting to ensure to us, but freedom of religion. They are not to dictate to us how we worship God or what we in fact believe.
Yeah, it was all about getting the government out of secularizing the country, quite frankly. And that's what it had been. And you quoted the First Amendment earlier, and I want to go back and emphasize that for just a second, because this is what we're told means separation of church and state. And it doesn't. Separation of church and state was always designed to keep the government out. Matter of fact, Thomas Jefferson is the American most famous for using that phrase, but nobody quotes any more than his 8 words, a wall of separation between church and state. Read the entire letter, 200 words, 3 paragraphs, really simple. And he told the Danbury Baptists that because of the wall of separation between church and state, government is not going to stop religious activities. And that was their concern, that the government might stop or try to regulate religious activities. So the wall of separation kept the government out, which is why, as you mentioned the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting for exercise thereof. Congress is the only one that's limited, not people, not churches, not schools. And so when they tell a kid, hey, kid, you can't say the word God at graduation, my question is, wait a minute, it says Congress shall make no law. Tell me how you parse the English language so that a senior means Congress and so that saying the word God means making a law. I mean, you can't even get there from that, but we bought into this thing that there has to be this secularization of the public square, and that's exactly the opposite of what the Founding Fathers wanted with that, exactly the opposite.
You know, can't we really say that one of the easiest ways to understand the intent of the Constitution is to go see what the Founding Fathers actually did?
Yes.
Once you see what they actually did, then a lot of this fog that's being thrown at us today. For example, I read where the early Congress voted $20,000 to put a Bible in every single government school because they said you can't have you cannot have education without exposure to God's Word. That's no such thing as education without God's Word. And so the government provided the Bibles. Now the government is trying to outlaw the Bibles in the public school.
Yeah, and if you want to go a step further past that $20,000, that was in 1777. In 1782, the first Bible printed in the English language was printed by the official printer of Congress. It has a congressional endorsement in the Bible recommending that Bible to the inhabitants of the United States. It has the congressional committees that check and supervise the project. And it says, and the reason they told Congress, they said, quote, this is a neat addition of the Holy Scriptures for the use of schools, end quote. Well, what do you do with that? And then if you jump to 1844, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, said, Hey, if a government-run school doesn't want to teach the Bible, it doesn't have to, but it's got to be a private school. If you're going to be a government-run school, you will teach the Bible. We're not going to have a government-run school that won't teach the Bible. I mean, this is the policy we had, and now today we're told it's exactly the opposite because the Founding Fathers wanted so, not by a long shot.
I remember when I was just in grade school, David, I had a teacher every day. She had her Bible laying on the corner of her desk. Yeah. And I think she even read to us from that Bible, but that was a few years ago. And so things have changed dramatically. Now, we've just got a little bit of time left, so I've got many questions, but the one I don't want to fail to get to, we are already in the heat of a presidential campaign. The primaries are coming at us, and there are many people that are telling us, vote for me, I have the answers, I will reverse the malaise that the country finds itself in, I will fix things. But tell me, of the candidates that are presently putting themselves forward as one who could lead our nation, are there candidates in that group that would understand what you're telling us today about the need to take America back to biblical principles?
Absolutely. I know a number of the candidates. I'm working very closely with several of them, and there is no question, based on record and based on beliefs and based on the fact I know them, have known them for years, that several will take us back in this direction. And I will tell you right up front, if you have a candidate that does not recognize moral absolutes and moral rights and wrongs, you're already starting at the wrong place. If they say, well, the Supreme Court spoke on marriage, and that's the end of it, so let's move on. No, that's not the end of it. God's already spoken. It's time to line up with God, not with the Supreme Court. So that's a good judging starting point. Second thing is, where are they on life? Because that's the first of the rights. If they will not protect the inalienable right to life, then they're not likely to protect the rest of your rights. So those are two easy starting points, and if folks don't have that as presidential candidates, if the candidates don't have those 2 points high on their list, and fortunately, I know of 7 or 8 of the candidates that do. That's very high on their priority list, and that's what we're looking for if we're going to preserve American exceptionalism.
Okay. When President Obama openly endorsed same-sex marriage before the 2012 election, I thought that would sink his ship. I thought the American people would never vote a person in that would openly endorse marriage between 2 men or 2 women. I was shocked. I was stunned. It indicated to me our nation is further gone into moral depravity than I thought we were. What did you think?
I agree. One of the things that we saw, and by the way, we regularly look in presidential elections since 1980, between 30 and 40 million evangelicals do not vote in those elections. And so as long as Christians are not going to be salt and light, don't be surprised that darkness wins out. I mean, that's a pretty easy principle. But the other thing we find, I just did a book with George Barton on national stats, and we're looking right now at only 1 out of 3 Christians believes that there is absolute moral truth. So that's Christians we're talking about. At this point, 76% of Christians, of Protestants, do not want to see Roe v. Wade ended. They do not want abortion ended. 65% of all abortions every year performed on Christians, and 200,000 abortions a year performed on born-again Christians. It's Christians that's keeping Planned Parenthood in the business. So until Christians get back to a biblical view of rights and wrongs, understand that the laws of nature and nature's God, it's going to be hard to get candidates who reflect that when Christians don't believe that. So we got to be the first ones to fix it. But my goodness, many of us already believe that, and when 30 to 40 million of us don't vote in an election, it's pretty hard to complain about the results when we didn't have a hand in it.
So I guess what we've got to be saying this coming year as we're approaching what may be one of our most critical ever elections, as we're approaching this election, maybe our watchword has to be Christians come out of the closet.
Yeah, that's right. And we also, when we do, we have to remember that righteousness exalts a nation, not economics. So do not vote your pocketbook. 45% of Christians vote economic issues over moral issues. That's not what God will bless. God will bless the moral issues, then your economics will follow that. So we have to come out of the closet, and when we get out, we have to remember to think biblically when we vote. And those principles of American exceptionalism is a really good guideline for thinking biblically and getting to the right conclusion on the candidates.
Okay, so just a brief bucket list, and I know we don't have time to list them all here, but you've already talked about same-sex marriage. You've already talked about abortion. So if a candidate does not pass those two things, then you just X them off the list.
That's right. Same-sex marriage, if you recognize same-sex marriage, that means you do not recognize an absolute moral law from God. So if you're wrong on the same-sex marriage issue, you're wrong on God's moral law. If you're wrong on the life issue, you're wrong on inalienable rights. And those two are simple modern indicators of an overall philosophy that does not comport with founding documents or with biblical principles.
Now, are there any other things that readily come to mind that you think a person, because there's a lot of people ask me, who do I vote for? What do I do?
Yeah.
Are there other things that come to mind that are really obvious that you could share with our audience?
Yeah, the one
today?
I would point to that is, I think, supreme, maybe above the other two issues, is Isaiah 126. When God's trying to restore the nation, he tells Isaiah, I'm going to do this, but he says, here's how I'm going to do it. He says, I'll restore your judges as at the beginning and your lawyers as the first, then you'll be called a nation of righteousness. And God links the righteousness of a nation to the judges in that nation. And if you look at where we are now, we don't have prayer out of schools because we voted out. It's because the judges told us it had to go out. Same with abortion, same with marriage. So the number one question we ought to be asking about every federal candidate, every federal in office, is what kind of judges will I get from this candidate? Because judges determine the righteousness of a nation, according to Isaiah 126. So that more so than what we're going to do with Iran, more so than what we're going to do with border, more so than what we're going to do with the economy, is what are you going to do with judges? Because that's the righteousness issue right there.
That's a tremendous insight, David. I appreciate you bringing that up, and I hope all of you really get that, because we haven't changed our Constitution. We just changed our judges, and we're getting the exact opposite rulings today that we've gotten for the last 200 years. It's flipped everything on its ear without us ever changing one word in the Constitution. Because of the judges. So great point. Well, listen, I regret that our time has come and gone. Mr. David Barton, the founder and president of WallBuilders, and you can go to his website, wallbuilders.com. David, you've been an invaluable resource to us here today. I really do thank you for it.
Thanks, brother, and thanks for all you do, and thanks for your great ministry. We really appreciate you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. David Barton, and we will have him. We need to have him much more often than we have had him on this program, because he is sort of a voice in the wilderness. Not only that, he's so scholarly, so skilled, and does such a marvelous job. I know that I saw his setup for his video, and he's got historical papers from the founding fathers. I mean, incredible materials. Oh, by the way, in case you've not yet subscribed to Endtime Magazine, ISIS in Bible Prophecy. That's the featured story this month. If you're not a subscriber to Endtime Magazine, do it now. The number to call, 1-800-END-TIME.
Politics and Religion is a production of Endtime Ministries. It is a daily 1-hour broadcast dedicated to bringing you the prophetic fulfillments happening on a daily basis.
If you would like to listen to archive shows, subscribe to Endtime Magazine, find a prophecy conference in your area, order Endtime resources, watch our TV show, or subscribe to our free weekly e-news, call 1-800-ENDTIME or go to endtime.com. and take advantage of what our site has to offer.
Connect to Endtime Ministries by partnering with us and help this message make a global impact.
Endtime Ministries is partner supported. We would like to say thank you to all of our loyal partners, listeners, and friends for helping make Politics and Religion and Endtime Ministries possible.